Hey everyone, it's Hannah and a bit of a different video for you today. So as you may or may not know, in short form content, i.e. YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, TikToks, I have a series which is called Demonstrating How Long a Film Is by How Much Knitting I Got Done During Said Film. Essentially, it's where I take usually a sock, actually it's only been a sock so far, into the cinema and I knit it for the duration of the film and I show how long the film is by how much of the sock I got done. Inevitably, on these videos, I receive comments asking how I knit in the dark. I could never knit in the dark. How do you manage to see what you're doing when you're knitting in the cinema? And all that fun stuff. So today, I thought I would tell you how to learn to knit without looking. But you may be thinking, Hannah, I don't need to learn to knit without looking. I'm perfectly fine looking at my knitting. And that may be the case. But as someone who cannot crochet without knitting, I realise how useful knitting without looking is. And maybe you will too if it is a skill you're able to learn. For me personally, I find it really useful for getting through the boring bits of knitting, whether that be endless stocking stitch. Sometimes socks can be a little bit boring. You knit them because you have to, because your husband wears through them so quickly and he loves wearing hand knit socks. Or you need to knit a sleeve, or you need to knit a body on a jumper. And, you know, sleeves don't seem to grow when you're looking at them and knitting them. I don't know, it just seems to go backwards. Depending how confident you are with your knitting skill, I personally cannot knit anything other than stocking stitch in the cinema. I recently got onto the point of where I started to turn a heel. I started knitting the heel flap, not turn the heel. Started knitting the heel flap on a sock during the film and my knitting slowed way down because I was knitting one, slipping one, and I was having to like concentrate and count as I was going whilst also watching the film. So I personally can't knit rib in the cinema. I can only really knit very basic things. If I'm at home knitting, then I would probably knit rib because then I can glance down every now and then. But if I'm knitting in the dark, stocking stitch sock, very useful. But if you're very comfortable with what you're doing, then maybe you will be able to knit lace working cables, but I'm not. I cannot. Not only is knitting without looking useful for cinema knitting, it's good because I can knit at the pub. I can do pub knitting and still talk to people and not look like I'm being rude even though I'm fully listening to what's going on, because I can maintain eye contact. Also, Dungeons and Dragons. I play Dungeons and Dragons. I also knit while playing Dungeons and Dragons and can keep being engaged, and I can look at the battle map and my knitting speeds up a little bit and my tension gets a little bit tighter, but that's also fine. It's also useful if you knit in the car. Sometimes if I'm looking down too much in the car, I start to get a little bit travel sick. So it's good if you're looking up, and also if you're just having, you know, film nights at home or you're watching something tense on TV, you don't miss the tense moments because you're looking at it. So how do you do it? I won't lie, it wasn't a conscious thing I learnt to do. It just kind of came, the more comfortable I got with knitting, it just kind of came fluidly and happily and naturally. And also I learnt whilst I was living in Germany, so I was watching German TV shows and I had to have the German subtitles on. Not English subtitles, German subtitles. You did hear that right. It's easier to understand what's going on when there's subtitles saying it as well, because sometimes the brain takes a second to catch up, at least in my experience. First up, I would recommend taking a note of how you knit, how it feels, how the technique that you use, regardless of what hand you hold the yarn in. I've heard some people say you can only do this if you knit continental. As someone who knits English style, and also a weird English style that I was taught by my mum and my grandma. I have a video on how I knit if you're interested. I knit exactly the same way. I don't do anything fancy to tension my yarn or anything, and I hold it like this in my right hand. Took a second, didn't it? And then yeah, just if you break it down, look at what you're doing and see what your hands are doing, what, you know, take note, mental note of looking at it, and then take mental note of how it feels, because ultimately that's going to be the important bit. So I know that the top of my needle is going to brush against my finger as I'm knitting, and that's how I know it's gone through the stitch. But obviously that might not be how you knit. Once you've established how you knit, challenge yourself every now and then to look up and knit a few stitches without looking at it. You might find that you knit slower to start with. Just take your time, knit a few stitches, then look down and see how you do, and then start again, look down and see how you do, and just gradually build it up. Challenge yourself to knit a full row, challenge yourself to knit a full round, and eventually you will get there. If you find that you can't resist looking down, you could train yourself by also watching shows with subtitles. I did actually find that really helpful. Or if you feel confident enough, knit in a dark room. I'm not saying go straight to the cinema, but if you're having film night at home, turn the lights off and yeah, knit in the dark for a bit and see how you do. There is no shame in needing to leave the room if you realise you've made a mistake. And speaking of mistakes, you really need to learn how to fix your mistakes if you're going to start knitting in the dark. When I knit in the cinema, I often take socks. I know exactly how many stitches I have on each needle. I knit magic loop because then I can't drop a needle. Once I've had a disaster where I dropped the mini skein and it rolled all down the cinema and I never found it again. Oops. However, every so often I stop and I count how many stitches I have on my needle to make sure I've not dropped any. If I find that I have dropped them, I leave the cinema and I go and stand just in the hall and pick them up and then come back in. And generally I haven't missed too much, but I feel like you do need to learn how to pick up a dropped stitch. Or sometimes I've created a stitch on the edge by accidentally doing a yarn over at the end of the previous row and then I've just knit into it. So yeah, learning to fix your mistakes is a very useful part of learning how to knit without looking, especially in the beginning, because you are guaranteed to make mistakes. At this point, I can quite confidently, touch wood, there's some, say that I've not made a mistake in knitting without looking in the cinema for it's quite a chunk of time now. Quite a chunk of time. But yeah. That's basically all I have to share with my experience of learning to knit without looking. If you have any tips that I've not included, because like I said, this wasn't a conscious decision. I didn't sit and think, right, today I'm going to practice knitting without looking. It just kind of came over time as I got more confident with my knitting and started knitting more. And I think knitting while quite drunk has also helped. I've knit lace while drunk before, don't do that. I did make a mistake in that. Because, you know, I was in my early to mid-20s when I was living in Germany, and therefore I was socialising and drinking quite a lot. Well, not quite a lot, but like often. And I would get quite diddly on several occasions. So I would just keep knitting at that point, and then got quite confident in my ability to knit without looking, because sometimes even with looking and you're a little tiddly, you don't know what's going on. But if you've got any tips, I'm not saying get drunk to learn to knit without looking, that's not what I'm saying. If you have any tips on how you learned to knit without looking or anything like that, please let me know in the comments down below. It might help someone out, and I'm not an authority on this. I'm sure there's plenty of other videos out there talking about how to knit without looking, and feel free to check them out if you think my techniques aren't going to work for you. That's your thing. My next big step is going to learn to crochet without looking. That's a little more unnatural for me, and I don't know why, but maybe that's the next thing that I work on next time I make like a Be Bold shawl or something. I could learn to crochet without looking. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and yeah, if you'd like to follow me on social media, please feel free. Links in the description box below, along with anything else that I think you might need. And with all that being said, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you very soon in the next one. Bye!